Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Slick Talk. I am your host, Joe. Today we're bringing you a conversation between myself and a really good friend of mine, also someone who took up an interest in used oil analysis naturally after I finished my training, started digging into the data. A lot of my friends and family wanted to know a bit more about oil analysis as well, and we naturally would sample their vehicles whenever we could. And this friend of mine has a 2013 Honda Accord, and we were able to dig into those reports, and we really found some interesting data. But we also think this conversation is great because it gives you not just the analyst perspective. You get to hear questions, thoughts, opinions from someone, much like many of you who might have an interest, might have some experience with used oil analysis, but now you have an opportunity to kind of get that back and forth between the analyst and a customer, someone who is really looking to take care of their car and just wants to know everything that oil analysis can do for them. So we have a lot of good content, a lot of good material here. Really hope you enjoy it. Before you leave the podcast app, whatever platform you're listening on, please don't forget to rate, review, subscribe, all that good stuff. We love to hear from you. So now, without further ado, episode 10 of Slick Talk. Enjoy. Today, I'm joined by customer slash friend of mine, Thomas.
Hey guys, good to be here.
When I started with Blackstone, first of all, I was new to oil analysis, so you were as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. I just knew that if it's black, it's probably not good anymore.
Yeah, yeah. That's kind of the first thing, along with it's a visual representation is always that's like the baseline for people with oil is if it looks bad, it probably is bad. But needless to say, after I started, I would probably talk to you on a daily basis about here's what I've been learning in training. Here's what I've been, picking up about, what you can find in oil analysis. So eventually we did get a sample. And first question, what intrigued you enough to get a sample from your car?
There was actually basically almost an immediate interest in getting a sample after you had been talking about them so much, because I know that was something that, you were interested in testing your own vehicles. And as soon as you started talking to me about what you were finding, I was really curious about what you might find in mine. Because I think everybody wants to know a little bit more about what they're driving. And, having the opportunity to just, hey, my buddy talks to me about this all the time. What's the chances that, we could talk about this? And give me, some insight on it as well.
And when we took the first sample, the results were, I wouldn't say catastrophic, but going back to that first report, what do you remember about it as far as the results and the analysis? What are some things that have stuck with you from that first report?
Well, so the first report was probably, I thought it was basically the end of the world, because I was pretty certain that you were going to tell me that I was going to have to take the car out back and shoot it. It was an awful, gut-wrenching feeling because, you approached it in about as good a way as you could. You sat me down and said, okay, listen. There are some things that could have happened here that explain this very well. And now I was sitting there like, oh God, he's going to tell me the car died. I'm going to have to bury her.
The fun thing, well, I guess you think it's fun, it ends up not being fun. But when I started with Blackstone and, obviously I wanted to get a sample from everyone's car that I knew. You have to give the results to them, and sometimes they aren't great. Yeah. And there was a terrible streak, and then finally, it's like anything else, you get on a roll, and you have a few good reports to send. But yeah, so this first one, I think I remember, and just to give a little bit more foundation, what Honda do you have, year, etc.?
Yeah, so I have a 2013 Honda Accord Sport Edition. And at the time that we were taking this test, it was, I think it was in 2017. And the car had like just over 60,000 miles. And just to give you all a little bit more perspective, I was not kind to this car. I drive like a jerk. So I was, and I don't know why I was going into this thinking like, oh yeah, it's going to come back great. I'm going to have the best car ever because it's my car, even though I drive like a jackass.
Well, I probably told you like a time or two that like Hondas usually look fantastic in analysis, and and so do Toyotas, and like, we're not shy about like mentioning that to customers. Like we don't send out like a list of the best engines, but in general, it's really safe to say like Hondas usually look really good. Like, and I don't know, buy really good. Just to give a little bit of insight into that, in testing, you're usually doing really well if every wear metal is in the single digits in parts per million. Like, that's usually as low as you can reasonably expect for oil that has any significant use. So yeah, going into that first report though, I remember you had, I want to say about like 7,500 miles on the oil. Is that right?
Yeah, just about.
7,500, and like for some people, like that's already getting nuts. Like for some people, that's like a lot. It's not really. Like you have the K24 engine, the 2.4 liter 4-cylinder, and yeah, I mean most of those are well capable of that kind of interval. I think probably in your owner's manual, I think it might say like 7 to 10.
I think it's something around that. And then it also, says, hey, you can also reference the light or the monitor that will tick down just as your mileage goes on.
Precisely. So, yeah, we're just laying a little bit of background on, on this first report. So you didn't have a crazy amount of mileage on the oil. You were a little hard on the engine. And then going into those results, I think you had iron was like in the 60s,
yeah,
I think.
It
60 parts per million. And yeah, that's well outside the average range. But like one thing I also remember about that report though, everything else looked, as far as metals go, I think everything else was clean, right? You didn't have any high readings apart from that.
I think the only other thing that was fairly high, at least that I thought was high, was the sodium was just a little bit elevated.
Mm-hmm.
But aside from that, I thought, hey, the rest of it looks good, so it's just, going to lose the engine, and that's fine. That's the only part I have to worry about is just all the iron that's murdering my engine.
Yeah, and I mean, the nice thing though too is that when you have just like that one high metal, it's not terribly often that alone shows a serious problem. Like back then, I was really starting to get my feet wet in analysis, so I was probably fairly worried about that reading too, like back then. But over the years, definitely learned that it usually takes more than one metal to show a problem. But yeah, with sodium though, that's an element I remember pointing out because it does show antifreeze, and that's, if there is one contaminant you don't want, it's that one.
Whoa.
Well, because it's just so expensive. If you have a coolant leak, like that just means money. Like that's, a fuel injector is kind of one thing. An air filtration leak, slap some duct tape on that. But like the coolant leak is kind of a whole different ballgame. So things went from okay in that first report for your Honda to another place.
Another place altogether.
Yeah, I want to talk about that report because we starting off, yeah, you had a less than ideal set of results, but then things really went like haywire. So let's go to that point in time. You had a really rough sample, but just going before you took it, what was going on with the car? What was what were the issues that popped up before you took this sample?
So I can remember at that point in time, I was having some pretty rough starts on the car, where, I'd turn it on and it would start to rev like it was a freaking airplane engine. And I didn't feel like I was getting the mileage that I thought I would get normally, and the car just felt like it was kind of riding a little rougher, which with the last report had me obviously on edge. So going into this one, I kind of had my fingers crossed. I was kind of bearing down, hoping that this is all just in my head and I just am making all of this up. The car's probably okay. I haven't been driving it as hard, which was just a lie I was telling myself. But yeah, so I had this really, really worried outlook on my car at that point in time.
And I think you might have the results handy. So this is a report I would have been. I mean, there is no particular level that is like by rule failure. I mean, there can be, when you have like in unison, like you're not going to get this from like a gasoline engine or a diesel engine, but like, okay, if there was a sample with 1,000 parts per million of metal and it was an engine sample, like, all right, we're probably looking at an obvious failure. But like when you get just in the hundreds, it can be a toss up. And I think you had, just going to the results, I think you had at least one metal in maybe the 300s.
Yeah, my iron was all the way up at 338 on that particular oil sample.
And I think you also had aluminum up there, you had chrome, a lot of cylinder area action, and also just, iron can be from anything steel. So you probably had, something from like, crank cams, etc. But lo and behold, though, the Honda's not in a junkyard, so something changed for the better. Going after that report, what do you have to do maintenance-wise? What were the repairs? What was involved in keeping that car on the road?
Yeah, so that's fairly interesting. Just a little bit more background. I was really worried about this car because, and I think I told you about this, the oil filter at some point got like a pinhole in it, and then all of the oil started to drain out of the car, and I didn't realize it because I was driving down the highway. Woke up the next day, turned it on, and I thought for sure it was making sounds like somebody had just come out late at night and beat it with a baseball bat. So I was like, well, that's it. We're selling it for scrap. But then came back and you told me, listen, you just put new oil in it. Why don't you just do a super short interval? Let's stop with the 8,000, 7,000 miles. Let's just do a nice, clean 3,000 mile check and see where we're at. Something standard. And then we did that, and, I have stopped lying to myself. I don't treat the car very nice, but I do treat it a lot better than I used to. I'm not quite as heavy on the gas, and I'm not, trying to do a bunch of drives in one day, especially shorter drives, because that's something we had talked about potentially being problematic.
Yeah, I mean, intervals are always going to be so car specific. I think that's one thing. We get it. I mean, that was a question you had. It's a question so many people have. I have this car. I'm running this oil. How long can I go? And it's just not, there's not a book of intervals specific to each engine like that. I mean, yeah, you have an owner's manual recommendation, but like, yeah, I mean, if you run your car a certain way, if you use it a certain way, that can cause it to make more metal than it otherwise would, and that would necessitate a shorter interval. So it is case by case, and you've been able to keep that thing going for, I mean, this really bad report came out in 2018.
Yeah.
And by all accounts, you're in good shape as, recent samples from that engine. I think you've had some recurring fuel dilution, but yeah, I mean, going to the more recent samples, what have they looked like?
Per your earlier suggestions, the metal is down for the most part. The iron's still in the double digits, but it's really low. I think it came in at 13 parts per million
Yeah.
last time we tested it. So that's obviously fairly encouraging. And all the other metals that we've talked about were all fairly low, if not like incredibly low, which is very nice to hear and see compared to what it was before. I think the
Yeah.
only thing that we've really had to kind of stay looking at would be that the fuel dilution and the oil. And we even had to talk about it, and I had somebody go in and look at it, and they said they couldn't find any problem with it.
Mm-hmm. And with that, I mean, chances are pretty good that some of that fuel is related to normal use too. I mean, when you do a lot of short drives, which I know you do, sometimes it just doesn't give fuel enough time to burn off, some of the raw fuel from startup. So that can be a normal source. And yeah, if you don't have like a rising oil level, other symptoms of a fuel system issue, then yeah, it's certainly possible that some of that's normal. Just going to be operational. But yeah, that whole chain of events, going from that rough report and then seeing the engine make a recovery, it's just like a perfect illustration of when people get a bad report, they have a really hard time kind of sitting tight until they get another sample. And it's a good illustration of how you really do have to see how trends build, because from our perspective, we have no way of knowing just how that engine's going to recover from that sort of episode. You're going to have to get another sample. And, trends showed that the engine made a really, really nice recovery.
Yeah, it was really nice to have you as a friend, tell me, hey, stick with it. Don't worry too much right now. We have to get back on this in a little bit, but I know you're worried about it. There's nothing we can do right this second.
Mm-hmm. And that's not your first car, though. And I feel like I just want to go back to the first car, because if there's ever a vehicle we should have gotten a sample from, it was that one. Let's talk a little bit about it.
All right, so you all need to buckle in, because I have a story to tell you about this car. It was my favorite car to date. It was I think it was a 2005.
05 sounds right.
05 Chevy Impala. And this thing could just tear it up. I love that car so much. But the reason that I had that as my first car, it was actually one of my family members' vehicles, their primary vehicle, and it was outside the house. And lo and behold, it actually gets struck by lightning somehow. And it was under like a massive tree, and I don't know how that was the thing that got struck by lightning, but it just, terrible things happened to this car. So she gets it fixed up, gets another vehicle, and gives me that one. And I'm thinking, sweet, free car. And this thing was awesome. It had leather seats. It had, the working CD player, the sunroof or moonroof, whatever you want to call it, decided when it wanted to work. But that was still cool because it was an opening, and what high school kid doesn't need one of those to, create problems? So it was great. And, it was still awesome even when it would turn off, because it had some bad parts, as one might expect a vehicle named Relampago, because it got struck by lightning.
I never remember hearing about the lightning strike. That's awesome.
That was the premise of the vehicle. That's what made it special. But yeah, it just turned off in traffic. All of it. Power steering, everything. No gas, just brake. I'd have to veer 4 lanes across moving traffic, trying to get us to safety.
Yeah, I would have liked to see a sample of every possible fluid from that car, because all of it was probably bad.
It's all bad.
Even the coolant was probably not in serviceable condition. And that's kind of a good plug for the fact that a lot of people just assume we only test the engine oil. We can test the transmission fluid. We can test the coolant. We can test the power steering fluid. We have guidelines on serviceability for all of that. So it would have been fun to look at that one for sure. I never got a sample from the Sunfire either. And I mean, what a beauty. I can guarantee the engine didn't look good. The transmission probably, manuals, just the fluid can stay in there. Most people are going to shudder at calling it fluid, but technically. So when it's a manual, you can leave manual transmission fluid in there a pretty long time, because like versus an automatic, a manual, it's just like splash lubrication, whereas in an automatic there's a lot of intricate channels and like unique oil passages. So that's why it matters so much that the oil has like nothing wrong with it, nothing, close to solid material, the correct viscosity and so on. But like a gear lube is just a much more crude application where it doesn't have all of that. There's not much going on basically in a manual versus an automatic. So that Sunfire was a manual, and that was probably my favorite aspect about it. So one segment I wanna make sure we do is take 3 elements that we look for in the spectral exam, and maybe pick 3 that you don't know about, or that you wonder why they're important, or maybe you're surprised that they matter in engine oil, or you're kind of curious what purpose they serve. So maybe grabbing 3 just at random, even whatever, that you might be surprised are even a factor.
Yeah, so I suppose some of the ones that are more interesting to me are, just off the top of my head here, boron,
Okay.
barium,
Mm-hmm.
and then the last one that I'd be kind of interested in is silicon.
Yeah, those are all pretty good, because there's just a lot of different directions to go, and I kind of want to start with barium. So that's an interesting one. It's going to be an oil additive. Not many at all use it. So if you scan to the right, if you look at universal averages, what does it show as typical?
For barium, it is at 0.
Yeah, so those basically the only oil, I mean, there's a few, but the main one, I should say, the primary one that uses barium is Motorcraft. So Ford engine oil. Motorcraft will tend to have a little bit in there, and by a little, I mean like 12 to 14. And, it is an additive, but really I mainly look at it as a marker. Like if people are curious, I'm not sure what oil's in there, I want it to be Motorcraft, or it should be Motorcraft, is it? That's kind of the first additive element I'll look at, is I'll see if there's a notable amount of barium in there. It's kind of more of a marker than anything else, because you'll only see it in pretty small amounts. So it doesn't really play a big role, but it is something that's interesting, and I always tie it to Motorcraft in my head. So you also had boron on the list, right?
Yes, sir.
So that's a really common detergent dispersant additive. So in engine oil, that's an additive that helps hold particles in suspension so they can be filtered. And that means it serves the same purpose as calcium, magnesium. It's going to vary a lot. Like, what is a level that you've had in your samples, and what is the level that averages for that Honda engine type show as typical?
So I've, in chronological order, I had 9 parts per million, 28, and then 53. So it's gone up every time, but the universal average is 45.
Yeah. So that, with an average like 45, that's a indicator that not every oil uses a notable amount. Because like when an oil does use boron, typically it'll be like somewhere in the hundreds. But yeah, the oils that don't use any pull that average down. And because you've had more in each sample, that doesn't mean that the engine's producing boron. It doesn't mean that, there's anything going on to create it in the engine. It's each oil that you've had has had more in it. And I'm pretty sure you've done all of your oil changes at the dealership, right? For the Honda, or...
All of them except the emergency one down at Indianapolis.
Okay. And yeah, typically, I think the last time I talked to this dealership, they mentioned that they had like a mobile one, like bulk supplier or something like that. So if you see like a change in the boron level, or any additive element for that matter, It's just going to mean that either they switch suppliers or the supplier they're getting it from switched their recipe. So yeah, changes in like additive elements are something that really people can get really hung up on that as a problem, or and like we will like try and mention that in a comment if there's not much else going on, because again, it's not a problem, but like we won't point that out if we have everything else to cover, like a spike in wear or, contamination or something else. We're not really going to have time. But yeah, a lot of people get hung up on that as a problem if they have a change in additive elements.
That makes sense. I do have one question for you. I know we got one more left.
Oh, right.
Overall, how much of the elements in parts per million category, how much of that would you say is additives versus wear metals? Because that's something that, I'm kind of curious about.
Yeah, so the majority, so as far as wear metals go, the ones that we're typically going to find in an engine, I would say, let's use that as an example: aluminum, chrome, iron, copper, tin, and then you'll occasionally get like an alloying metal like nickel, very rare cases titanium, but that's very rare. Usually if titanium is in there, it's a wear metal. So everything else is going to be additive pretty much. And silicon is one, it just has a ton of different sources. Additive can be one. Some oils use silicon as an anti-foaming additive, and the main one would be Redline. And you'll see it like similar to barium. It'll be like a fairly low amount, something like 15 or maybe as high as 20. But yeah, it's not going to be terribly high. But silicon can also come from things like sealers or lubes, like if you install a new gasket, or if you fix an oil leak. You install like new seals, something like that, then silicon can come from that, harmlessly so. The main reason we point it out, or we would flag it, is because it can show abrasive contamination, something like dirt or debris getting in past the air filter. And that's why we would highlight it and talk about it as a potential concern. So you'll see that as an additive. But yeah, so I guess going back to the question, yeah, the majority of what we're going to be looking at is probably additive. And then, the rest of it's wear metals. And then you'll have other elements reading at like really small, like trace levels. So as someone who's done a few, you've had a few samples, you have some familiarity with reports. So what is maybe a concern that you have now, or what is something that you are always going to be looking out for in a sample now that you have some knowledge of what we can find? What's going to pop up in a report? What's maybe something that you have on your mind when you take the next sample?
Yeah, so the next time I get a sample, obviously I think just a bit of scar tissue left over from these last ones, first place my eyes are probably going to go to is checking to see how the iron's doing, and then checking to see where the fuel viscosity is. Because those have been the two things that seem to hang around the longest for me. But I think one thing that, we've talked about several times, including today, is, checking to see if we have wear metals occurring together. Is there, one or two? Is it three of them that are all acting up? Because, that obviously is indicative of something worth noting. So I think that's probably going to be my biggest, check, is just to see those two, iron and the oil contamination, and the viscosity.
Right. And viscosity it's something to watch when you have fuel, because if you have some fuel but it's not thinning the oil significantly, or it's not coinciding with poor wear, then it's possible that's something you just need to monitor, and you just need to see that it's not getting worse. But yeah, if it's not thinning that viscosity down, it's often just something that's operational. Even if there is like an injector that's leaking a little bit, Is that something you really need to make repairs? Well, let's take it with the rest of the report. But I think another interesting area to go to, though, is what is like maybe an assumption you had about maintenance, vehicle maintenance, that maybe oil analysis has changed. For a lot of people, that is the 3,000 mile oil change. People will like test and they'll assume that the oil shouldn't be in use longer than that. Like some people will only send in a sample because they went longer than 3,000 miles and they're worried that they ruined the engine. Like that's still a concern to that degree for a lot of people. So is there anything like that maybe that you don't worry about anymore that you might have, or just a common assumption about vehicle maintenance that you don't really take seriously anymore, or anything like that?
So one thing that I would definitely say has changed is kind of that idea of mileage, but actually a little bit in the opposite direction. I figured as long as the car is telling me, that little meter is ticking down and it's saying, oh, you got 30% of the oil life left, you're good. That's kind of changed. And just trying to keep the oil wear or the engine wear, down by increasing the frequency with which I get oil changes, lowering that interval, that mileage interval, is one thing that I think has changed after these. The other thing that has changed after these several samplings is the understanding that if there is a high number, it's not going to go away necessarily in the next one, even if it's a shorter interval, because, as you always tell me, you can't get all of the oil out of the engine. There's going to be some leftovers. So just keep in mind, even if you do a short interval and you have another high number, as long as it's not going up, stick with it. Don't worry about it so much right now, because you're going to have to flush that a couple different times to try and get all that wear metal out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially when you have something that's up in the hundreds, there's going to be some carryover there too. Well, yeah, but it will be interesting. I think we'll do another one of these when you get another sample in. We can kind of revisit how metals are trending. Looking to see if there. I mean, hopefully not, but maybe there's some new concerns. Maybe there's some something else to monitor. So we'll follow up at the next oil change then.
That sounds great. Look forward to it.
All right. Thanks for joining us.
Have a good one. Stay safe in the quarantine.
Yes. And that brings episode 10 to a close. But before we let you go, we want to provide a brief update on Blackstone and how we're managing the COVID-19 situation. Just a friendly reminder that we are still running our full operation. That means whatever you're sampling, if you get the sample to our door, we can indeed test it. Now, shipping difficulties do exist, as it can take longer for samples to reach us just due to the world reacting to the pandemic. But if you can get your sample to our door, we can test it. We can send you reports just like we normally would. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Just hit up our Facebook, Insta, or email. Once again, that email is bstone@blackstone-labs.com. If you have any questions, we'd love to hear from you, so don't hesitate to reach out. And once again, thank you for supporting the show. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah, when I first recorded with Kyle, and episode 1, I was trying to like really nail it, like one take performance, because that's just what I'm used to. Like, I've never done something with my voice before where we could just fix it. Like it's going to be a performance. It's going to be like theater or speech, where if you mess that up, you're done. So like, started recording episode 1, and then I flubbed like the intro, and then I was like, cut. I said, Kyle, wipe that. Just destroy it. He goes, really? And I was like, just, I need a minute. I was like, turn the mic off. And then the guy was just, I was hot. And then he was like, no, he's like, it's just jazz, man. You just keep going. And then eventually we make lemonade. And I was like, that's so weird. It's so weird to be like, yeah, I'm going to start recording and we can just mess up as much as we want and we're never going to cut. And then we're going to fix it. So it's always been weird.